I used to work at a place called O'Hurley's General Store here in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. It was a real old-timey general store, the kind that sells everything from buckets and barrels to books and pocket watches. In addition to the regular selection of groceries and liquor, it was an alright job for a young man such as myself, patronized by generally polite and well-meaning folk. Sure, I had a fair few drunks get a little rowdy when I wouldn't sell them hard liquor on a Sunday, but nobody ever put a gun in my face. But that ain't to say that I didn't have one or two incidents in there that put the fear of God into me. And this here is one of them. So I'm working late one Saturday night, stocking shows and cleaning house when a man walks in wearing a black tailored suit. It was one of those that fit him like a glove and gave off an obvious air of wealth, which marked him as an out-of-towner in my book, but that suit was just about the only normal thing about him. He was white as the cotton field, so pale, he was almost gaunt, with razor-sharp facial features and slicked-back silver hair. I hear the little bell on the front entrance tinkle. So I do my thing, and walk back behind the counter to serve him, which is where I laid eyes on him. He walks up to me, and with this wolfish smile on his lips, asked me for a can of lighter fluid. I fetch him when he asked for, making a little small talk as I ringing them up on the register. I asked him where he's from. DC, he replies, just passing through. I gave him a polite smile and asked him if he was one of those politician types. To which he gives the vague reply of something like that. He then proceeds to take out the biggest roll of dollar bills I've ever seen in my life, all hundreds from what I could tell, then places one down on the counter in front of me. I give the man his change, remarking that it's a good thing. It had been a busy previous few hours, or indeed have wiped me out for change. I said it in this fairly jokey tone, expecting him to at least give a polite chuckle in return, but he doesn't so much as smirk. He just takes out the Zippo lighter from his suit pocket, just about the shiniest I'd ever seen, and proceeds to fill it up with the lighter fluid right there in front of me. I've seen a fair few of those letters in my time, but never one that I could have sworn was plated with silver. I figured he must have been hankering for a smoke, something fierce, and I told him as such, but he replied that he didn't smoke. Right as he says that, he finishes up filling up his lighter, but not before accidentally spilling the little of the lighter fluid onto his finger. Then, just before he pieces the shiny-looking Zippo back together, he brings the finger to his mouth and sucks the drop of flammable liquid from his finger like it was a drop of homemade wine or something. Now, naturally, I quietly recoil when he does that, not quite being able to believe what I just witnessed. He sees me do so, and shoots me another one of those wolfish grins. Like he enjoyed the idea of freaking me out like that. I was just on the verge of asking him what that was all about when I hear the doorbell of the general store tinkle again. I look over towards the front entrance, and in walks this young lady who looks to be about the same age as my little sister. Couldn't have been no older than about 14 years old. Only she's dressed much younger, almost like how you'd expect a toddler to dress. And this denim skirt type thing with white embroidered flowers on it. She's dressed as him as daddy, so I figured it was his daughter, and tells him she needs to use the bathroom. The man in the suit and turns to me as if there's a bathroom that his daughter can use. So I give them the key to one that we had inside the store. Only instead of just handing it to his kid, he takes out a little leather wallets-looking thing from his jacket and hands that the lighter than the key to the little lady, who then makes her way off towards the door before locking it behind her. I started to feel incredibly uncomfortable. Something about the whole situation just didn't sit right with me at all. I had a sneaking suspicion of what was contained inside the small leather wallet thing. But I didn't feel like I was in any position to confront the suited man on it. Especially not based solely on a hunch. But it wasn't just that the kid looked absolutely nothing like him. She had the soft, rounded, delicate features along with real curly hair, while the suited man's face, so sharp he looked like he could have cut a swath through a pumpkin patch. And the way she called him, Daddy, a girl that age should be well on to calling her father Dad Popper. Anything but Daddy. I tried to distract from my discomfort by asking him where he and his daughter were headed. You ask a lot of questions, don't you, young man?" he replied, dropping what had once been a kind of formal civility entirely, and proceeded to stare a hole through me. His eyes, man, he had these narrow brown eyes so dark that were almost black, and I felt a shudder run through me as he fixed his gaze to mine. "Just making conversation," I remember saying back to him, shifting nervously behind the counter. "We know how the old saying goes, don't you?" His voice was smooth, just creepily calm, like there was no emotion behind it whatsoever. Curiosity killed the cat. The suited man turned and then started walking up and down the aisles, eyeing up the products like we were some quaint backwater relic, which I suppose was exactly what we were. I get back to cleaning house for a minute or two only. It's more just going through the motions while I keep an eye on what this guy is doing. I figured it'd only be a minute or two before his kid emerges from the bathroom, and they fixed get back on the road. The 5 minutes goes by, then 10, and still no sign of her. Just as I'm about to ask him if he thinks she's okay in there, the bathroom door unlocks with a loud snap and the door opens up. There's no flush, nothing to indicate she'd actually been using the bathroom for its intended purpose. And when she emerges, she seems all sleepy and dozy looking. Then she hands back the keys and the lighter and the black leather wallet to the suited man in a daze, before giving him a lazy sounding "Thank you, Daddy." The way she said it right then, I knew he wasn't her father, and it was dripping with sleeves. And the look he gave her in return was one a father should never, ever give his daughter, under any circumstances. It made me sick to my stomach. And I wanted the pair of them out of my store immediately. But we rarely just come out and say something like that where I'm from. We'll say something with an implication, if you catch my drift. "Safe travels now," I remember saying to the suited man. My tone was friendly, but the look I gave him was not. He turns and looks at me like he was about to go through me for shortcut, and like he could have eaten me without salt there. And then he walks up to the counter, places the bathroom key down on top of it, and says one final thing to me. "Remember, young man, curiosity killed the cat." And then he walks that little lady out of the store and then drove off into the night. I seriously considered calling the sheriff right after they left. But what was I going to tell him? That a man was traveling with a girl that appeared to be his daughter? I'd be laughed right off the line. I could have mentioned that I thought that there was something illegal in the leather wallet that he'd handed her. But I got the distinct impression that nothing we could ever accuse him of was really going to stick. He had all that money. And that look he gave me too. So I didn't say a word to anyone. But for the remaining few hours of my shift and for the next few days, I heard his words rattling around my skull whenever I paid any mind to him at all. Curiosity killed the cat. On the night of March 15, 1989, Tracy Lynn Kirkpatrick was working at Aileen Ladies Sportswear in Frederick, Maryland. Tracy was an introverted young woman, often opting to communicate her thoughts and feelings through handwritten poetry than actual verbal conversation. She was also something of a bookworm and excelled in her academic life. She was also extremely hardworking, holding positions to retail jobs in order to save money to pursue for a law degree at an Ivy League university. One of these jobs was at the previously mentioned sportswear store. We're on the night in question. She was working in the closing shift at around 6 p.m. On March the 15th, Tracy's mother arrived at the store to bring her daughter some dinner. She was a supportive, loving parent who often brought Tracy a plate of home-cooked food, which Tracy would then share with her colleagues on duty. She later said that nothing appeared amiss at the store and that her daughter seemed to be in a perfectly jovial mood. 2 hours later, Tracy's manager finished her shift and departed the store, as it was routine that lower employees would cash up and lock down the store at the usual closing time at 9 p.m. No sales were recorded after that point. So if there had indeed been any visitors, they certainly hadn't bought anything from any of the clerks. After closing, one of the unit's security guards happened to notice that some of the store's lights were still on, long after they should have been turned off. So at around 10:30 p.m., he entered the store to investigate the situation. Concerned there may have been an intruder who was using the lights to steal merchandise. Having broken in using a back door, he took out his key to unlock the front entrance of the store only to find that it was still unlocked. Deeply concerned, he thoroughly searched the front and back areas of the premises, only to make a terrifying discovery. And one of the back storage rooms lay Tracy Lynn Kirkpatrick. There was a puddle of blood beneath her unconscious body, along with stab wounds to her chest and back. The security guard then rushed to call emergency services, hoping she could still be saved. But on arrival, paramedics found that she could not be revived, and they announced her dead on the scene. Police then arrived to cordon off the area so that a forensic examination could be undertaken. Horrifyingly enough, Tracy's parents were also on their way to the store, concerned that the daughter was having car trouble and might need a ride back home. But when they arrived on the scene, they saw the blue flashing lights of police cars, and feared for the worse. We cannot imagine how painful it was to have their worst nightmares confirmed that their only daughter had been murdered by some mysterious assailant. All throughout the investigation that followed, Frederick homicide detectives failed to identify any singular motive for her slaying. The cash in the store's registers was still present. Tracy had not been indecently assaulted, nor did she appear to have any obvious enemies who might wish to see her come to harm. There was no evidence of any chase or struggle which suggested that Tracy knew her murderer as they approached to fatally wound her. Yet not a single person working at the store that day had seen anything suspicious, or could suggest anyone they thought to be guilty of such a horrific crime. Investigators were completely and utterly flummoxed. That was until 3 months later, when a person called into the U.S. National Confessions Hotline. A recording of the call was made which reads as follows. "Hello, my name is Dawn, and I'm calling from Frederick, Maryland. I know this is going to sound surprising, but 3 months ago, I stabbed to go to death. And you might think that in making this tape, I'm setting myself up to be caught. But there are a lot of guys named Dawn and Frederick. The girl I killed was working in a lady sportswear store, often came by and talked to her when she was working alone. And one night when she was in the storeroom and we were talking, our conversation turned into an argument. And so I took out a knife I had with me at all times and I killed her. And a few days later, I realized I had created a lot of sadness, and I thought about turning myself into the police. But whatever they do to me, they won't bring Tracy back. So I've decided that I better keep free because we have the death penalty in Maryland. Thanks for listening. I'm sorry about what I did. But nothing can change it." By staff from the confession hotline forwarded a copy of the recording to Frederick police, and the call was traced to a place called Walkersville, a small town in the same county that was just less than 10 miles away from the alien lady sportswear. 2 weeks after the call, a self-proclaimed psychic telephoned Frederick police, informing them that their investigations should center around a man she only referred to as Sean. She claimed the Sean character was acting strangely regarding the case, going as far as sending her clippings from newspapers and asking her bizarre and probing questions about Tracy Lynn Kirkpatrick, apparently willing to follow up any lead they had, no matter how ridiculous sounding. Frederick police then descended into Walkersville, where they played the audio recording of the confession to various members of the public in the hopes of that might be able to identify the voice on the tape. As it turned out, several people recognized the voice on the tape is neither Sean nor Dawn, saying it belongs to someone whose identity was never made public by investigators. This man was never arrested or formally charged with Tracy Lynn Kirkpatrick's murder. And despite thorough searches of his property and his complete lack of alibi, he was subsequently rolled out as a suspect. Essentially, the identity of Tracy Lynn Kirkpatrick killer is a complete mystery. But there is one interesting detail that seems to have been completely overlooked by law enforcement. You see, there was a man named Don present at the sportswear store that night. The same security guard that apparently stumbled across Tracy's body is named Don Barnes, Jr. And his father is none other than Don Barnes Sr., who was actually the sheriff of Frederick County at the time, but Kirkpatrick's murder. Despite him being one of the only people present at the time she was murdered. Don Barnes Jr., has never been considered a suspect. Now, this could easily be because whoever committed the murder was well aware of Don's presence in the area on the night of the murder, and sought to implicate him. But even if this was the case, surely Don would have faced some form of casual questioning, given that no one else was present when Tracy Limca Patrick's body was found. It apparently he didn't, and many have alleged that this is because Don Barnes Jr. was actually a prime suspect, whose involvement was completely covered up at the hand of the sheriff father. However, the allegations of nepotism are exactly that. Purely allegations. And since no single person has been charged or implicated in the crime in any serious way, the case remains and may forever remain unsolved. 26-year-old Deborah Deanne Poe grew up in Northern Virginia near Washington, D.C., eventually moving to Orlando, Florida in late October of 1989. Whilst in Orlando, Deborah rented the duplex with a female roommate, fostering dreams of purchasing her own home with the profit she hoped to make from her fledgling catering company. In order to realize their dreams, Deborah worked 2 jobs in the Orlando area, one being in the sales department of the Orlando Sentinel newspaper, and the other working 5 nights a week as a clerk at the Circle K convenience store on the intersection of Hall Road and Aloma Avenue, where she was entirely alone whilst on the job. Scott Yagi, another clerk at the Circle K, who also happened to be Deborah's boyfriend, handed over his shift to her at around 11 p.m. On February 3, 1992, hours later, Scott returned to the Circle K to see how Deborah was holding up. She was relatively new to the company and was blessed that her boyfriend was willing to put time aside to assist her in her nightly duties. When Scott was sure that she would be okay, he drove home to get some rest, expecting a call from Deborah once she had finished her shift at around 7 a.m. The ED never received one shortly after 3 a.m. on the morning of February 4th. A friend of Deborah's happened to be driving by the Circle K store. She attests that she saw Deborah behind the counter, clearly recognizing her distinct hairstyle from some distance away. However, around a half hour later, a customer parked up in her vehicle in the Circle K's parking lot and walked inside the store to buy a pack of cigarettes. This particular customer was a regular visitor at the time of the night, given that she to work the late shift did her job. So even though Deborah had only worked there a short time, she had become accustomed to seeing the sleepy-eyed young clerk behind the counter. But to her surprise, when she walked in that night, there wasn't Deborah on duty. In fact, the man who stood behind the counter didn't appear to be an employee of Circle K at all. Given that instead of the usual uniform, he was wearing a black Megadeth t-shirt emblazoned with a fire-breathing dragon. The customer inquired if he was a new employee, to which the strange man replied in the affirmative. She then asked where Deborah was, and was confused when the strange man didn't seem to know who she was. After all, the Circle K team were a close-knit bunch that included a romantic couple. What if this young man was indeed a new employee? It was perfectly understandable that he might not be entirely familiar with his colleagues yet, so his answer didn't arouse too much suspicion. The customer shrugged it off, then asked the clerk for a pack of their favorite cigarette brand. He had not only did the strange man not seem to be familiar with where the cigarettes were located or which brand was which. He seemed to have a great deal of trouble operating the register too. Yet as with her previous inquiry, the customer simply put it down to the teething pains of a new hire, and calmly waited for her changes. The strange man pushed one by after another before the cash register finally popped open. As she left the store, she heard the strange man lean over the counter and say, "You really shouldn't smoke, you know," and a tone that left her feeling distinctly creeped out. Then, just another half hour later, another customer walked into the Circle K only to find it completely deserted. They called out for service, but no one came to their assistance. Something didn't sit right with them at all. So they made the decision to call the local sheriff's department to warn them that something bad may have happened. Police arrived a short while later discovered that Deborah's red Toyota was still in the parking lot, all locked up. Strangely, they found not only were her purse and paycheck still in the car, but also that her actual car keys were locked inside too. On inspecting the interior of the Circle K store, The cops then found what they assumed was Deborah's Circle K uniform, folded and neatly placed behind the counter. The register was secured, there was no obvious sign of theft of either cash or product. Neither was remotely out of the place. It was as if that night, Deborah had simply vanished into thin air. A canine unit was called in, and the dog handler gave his canine a whiff of debris uniform, instructing it to follow the scent. The search dog then rushed around to the rear of the store building, alerting on two distinct spots on a section of pavement. The first was a patch of concrete behind a derelict business just next to the Circle K, and the other seemed to be through a gap and a large wooden fence then led into the parking lot of the neighboring apartment complex. After that, the search dog seemed to lose her trail. The sudden loss of the scent trail led investigating sheriff's deputies to conclude that Deborah had either willingly entered a vehicle which promptly drove off or had done so under duress. But since Deborah hadn't returned to either her job, her boyfriend, or her rented apartment, the only real question was who might want to abduct the hardworking and personable young woman. What quickly became obvious to investigators was that the solitary nature of Deborah's work made her a very easy and obvious target for kidnapping. She was an attractive young woman working alone in a gas station in the middle of the night, at a time when there was no CCTV cameras present to record the interior or exterior of the business. According to her boyfriend, there was also no shortage of bothersome customers to include on the list of suspects, some of whom harmlessly flirted with Deborah. Others, she complained, had made some legitimately predatory remarks to her when they came in drunk in the wee small hours. Her boyfriend told the police of one particular incident that Deborah complained of, which occurred just a fortnight prior to her apparent abduction. According to her, a semi-naked man ran into the Circle K and hopped over the counter, where he then attempted to indecently assault her. Deborah was then pursued around the store for a few minutes, then chased outside to the gas pumps, where she was able to evade the man and make it back to the store before him, where she promptly locked the doors to keep them out. It was only when Deborah had secured a full-time sales position at the Orlando Sentinel that her family and boyfriend pleaded with her to quit working at the Circle K, citing the dangers of working alone in the middle of the night. However, Deborah refused, arguing that she needed the extra hours in order to raise funds to put towards starting up that dream catering business of hers. As a kind of compromise, Scott began to accompany her to work, remaining in his car while she worked and drinking coffee to stay awake so that he could keep an eye on her. But this only irritated Deborah, who complained that she didn't need to be chaperoned, especially when her boyfriend should be at home, getting the sleep he needed to complete his own full-time hours. After collecting statements from various eyewitnesses, police decided that their investigation should focus around the creepy-sounding Megadeth fan who was standing behind the counter when the smoker arrived to buy cigarettes. The Orlando Sentinel ran a missing persons ad in the classified section every day for 11 years after abduction, ending in December 2001. The information yielded from the ads proved useless. After more than 30 years, the hundreds of tips from the general public, this man has yet to be identified. There were also some doubts that he was even involved in her disappearance at all, given that he could have walked into the store, possibly drunk, saw that there was no one behind the counter, and decided to play at being a clerk for an hour or so. But it would have to be something of an extraordinary coincidence that he had been present in the store just a matter of minutes after she was supposedly abducted. Either way, police were never able to identify or question the man, and so his identity and level of involvement remain a complete mystery. In the immediate aftermath of Deborah's disappearance, police were not in position to go public with all the information they had to handle, since they were worried that it might frighten their suspect into fleeing the area altogether. But after 3 months of no luck in their investigation, Orange County Sheriff's Department held a press conference in which they revealed a composite sketch of the so-called Megadeth man. He was believed to be aged between 19 and 25, with long wiry dark hair and brown eyes. Aside from the Megadeth t-shirt he was wearing on the night in question, a witness had described him as wearing a skull ring on his left hand, along with the crucifix piercing dangling from his right ear. But perhaps most importantly, a black van has been parked outside at the time of his appearance, one with a large, colorful Megadeth mural airbrushed onto the side. It was believed that this detail would make him easy to identify, since such a vehicle was likely to be very memorable and somewhat unique. Then in August of 1990, a man riding an ATV made a grisly discovery near Tuoloma Avenue, a road that was only 2 miles away from where Deborah was last seen alive. It was a decomposing human corpse, mostly skeletal. And due to the geographical and physical similarities, it was believed to be Deborah's. However, much to the relief of her family and friends, the jewelry on the corpse was found to bear no similarities to that which they knew that Deborah owned. And after a comparison that was made between the corpse's bite pattern and Deborah's dental records, the possibility of that being the missing clerk was ruled out. It gave her family hope that she might still be alive. Over a year after the corpse's discovery in November of 1991, Deborah's case was featured on the popular TV show Unsolved Mysteries. Over 150 viewers from all over the country called in with fresh information, most of which involved the identity or location of the Megadeth man seen behind the counter that night. Orange County Police also received a call from law enforcement officials up in Virginia, who told them they were investigating a remarkably similar case, and actually had a suspect in their custody who matched the physical description of the Megadeth man. However, despite the physical similarities, detectives were unable to charge the man up in Virginia, and were forced to investigate other suspects during the following few years, one of which was an ex-boyfriend of Deborah's who she had broken up with citing mental instability. And another came to the attention of detectives as of late 1998. Following reports that he would talk constantly about Deborah's disappearance with an apparently unhealthy interest. But once he was confronted by police, the man simply lawyered up and refused to talk about it anymore, subsequently dodging a charge for her abduction. Almost 12 years later, in March of 2000, a large team of Orange County Sheriff's deputies and volunteer search and rescue personnel assembled in an empty lot behind the Chapel Hill Baptist Church and Troy Barthelman Road in Orlando. They spent around 14 hours intensively searching the 1-acre lot, which was only around 3.5 miles from the Circle K gas station, having identified it as a possible location for debris remains. Their reasoning was that it was in close proximity to the home of a new suspect in the case, refused to say just who that was in reference to that day. 5 of the 6 search canines present alerted to there having been human remains and an overgrown section of the field. The 12 hours of excavation that followed yielded nothing of significance. Although that didn't roll out. The Deborah's body had been buried there following her murder, and then moved at some point during the early stages of the investigation into her disappearance. However, terrifyingly enough, local newspapers discovered that this location was close to the apartment of none other than Deborah's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance, Scott Miyagi, the very same man who had been so insistent that the blame lay with one of the men harassing her, was now prime suspect in what was by that point assumed to be her murder. Yet he too was never officially charged with any crime. It has been more than 30 years since Deborah Deanne Poe disappeared from her job at the Circle K gas station Orlando, Florida. 30 leads of dead ends, bad leads, and failed charges. There have been no human remains discovered that had ever been successfully identified as belonging to her. No one has ever come forward claiming to be her, and no one has ever confessed to her murder. For all intents and purposes, Deborah simply vanished into thin air that night, never to be seen again. Even as the world ventured into the era of camera phones, internet, media, and communities of people obsessed with unsolved mysteries, there have been no significant developments in her case 30 years later. The question remains, just what exactly did happen to Deborah Deanne Poe?